At 10:15 a.m. on April 9, 1943, a 30-year-old Soviet captain named Alexander Pokryshkin pulled himself up into the cockpit of a strange new fighter sitting on a muddy airstrip near Krimskaya in southern Russia. The aircraft in front of him was American-built. Its cockpit sat high above spindly landing gear, with a long nose and a mid-mounted engine tucked behind the pilot. Western pilots had already decided this machine was a failure. The British had tested it and sent it back. American squadrons in the Pacific were dumping it as fast as replacements arrived. In most air forces, the Bell P-39 Airacobra was considered an embarrassment, the worst fighter America had put into combat. Yet within a few months, Pokryshkin and other Soviet pilots would rack up thousands of kills in this failed fighter. And by the end of the war, they'd prove that the P-39 wasn't a bad aircraft at all. It had just been used in the wrong war, in the wrong way. On paper, the P-39 should have been a star. The very first prototype, the XP-39, flew in April 1938 with a turbocharged Allison engine. In tests, it screamed to almost 390 miles per hour at 20,000 feet and could claw its way up to that altitude in around 5 minutes. For a late 1930s design, that was serious performance. Then the U.S. Army Air Corps fixed it. In 1939, the prototype went to the NOCA wind tunnel at Langley. Engineers found that the external turbocharger installation created drag. Bell suggested a simple solution: strip out the turbocharger and use only a single-stage, single-speed supercharger on the engine. It made the airplane lighter and cleaner. It also quietly destroyed its reason for existing. Without the turbo, the Allison ran out of breath above roughly 15,000 feet. At 20,000 feet, the P-39 was wheezing. By typical Western bomber altitudes, 25,000 feet and higher, the aircraft was effectively out of the fight. It could get there, but it couldn't climb, couldn't accelerate, and couldn't maneuver with any confidence. For the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces, both building their doctrine around high-altitude bomber escort and interception, that was a fatal flaw. The British tested the export version, the P-400, in late 1941. On low-level test runs, it felt promising, but as soon as pilots took it upstairs, the mask slipped. Above the mid-teens in altitude, it was clearly inferior to Spitfires and Hurricanes. Then came something even more worrying: the spin behavior. The P-39 carried its heavy V-12 engine behind the pilot and a 37mm cannon up front, firing through the propeller hub. With a full cannon drum, the aircraft's center of gravity sat in a safe, forward position. Fire off most of that ammunition, and the balance shifted rearward. British test pilots reported that under certain conditions, the aircraft could snap into a vicious flat spin with almost no warning. Recovering from that spin was extremely difficult and sometimes impossible. A few near-fatal incidents were enough. The RAF wrote the type off and pushed it to the side. The Americans discovered different problems in a different theater. In early 1942, U.S. squadrons took P-39s and P-400s to the Southwest Pacific: New Guinea, Port Moresby, Guadalcanal. On the ground, pilots liked the way the aircraft looked: sleek, tricycle landing gear, big gun in the nose. In the air, it became a disappointment. Japanese bombers typically came in at 18,000, 22,000 feet, escorted by agile A-6M fighters. P-39 pilots scrambled, rammed the throttle forward, and pointed their noses up. The first few minutes of the climb felt fine. Then they hit 15,000 feet. The rate of climb sagged. The aircraft felt mushy and underpowered, like it was dragging itself through wet concrete. Controls went soft. The Allison engine, deprived of dense air, simply didn't have much left to give. By the time many pilots got within sight of the bombers, they were still thousands of feet below, with no energy and no good options. Zeros could pick and choose when to attack. They would dive down, turn rings around the struggling P-39s, and climb back to safety. The Bell fighter, at those altitudes, was outclassed in every category that mattered. The firepower that looked so terrifying on the spec sheet also turned out to be unreliable in those conditions. The 37 mm M4 cannon fired a massive shell. One hit could tear a bomber apart, but the rate of fire was painfully slow, and the gun had a bad habit of jamming after just a few rounds. In the heat, humidity, and mud of Pacific airfields, keeping that cannon running was a constant fight. Many missions saw P-39s launch with the cannon disabled altogether, turning that huge nose into dead weight. Two 50 cal machine guns in the nose were effective, but the extra 30 cals in the wings did little against tough Japanese aircraft. Pilots joked that the export version, the P-400, was just a P-39 with a zero on its tail, implying it was more dangerous to its own pilot than to the enemy. By the end of 1942, the 5th Air Force in the Pacific had roughly broken even in P-39 combat. Around 80 Japanese aircraft downed for a similar number of P-39s lost. A 1.1 exchange ratio against an enemy that already had the initiative was unacceptable. If you wanted to seize control of the sky, your fighters had to do better than a coin flip. Only one American pilot, Lieutenant William Fiedler, managed to become an ace in the type, scoring 5 kills in the Solomon Islands. Even that story ended grimly. He died on the ground when a crippled P-38 crashed into his parked P-39 and exploded. To American eyes, that summed up the Airacobra. The one man who actually made it work was killed sitting in it. By mid-1943, U.S. units were pushing P-39s into training roles or out to backwater theaters as quickly as P-38s, P-47s, and P-51s became available. As far as the U.S. and Britain were concerned, the P-39 story was over. They were wrong. While Western planners chased high-altitude bomber doctrine, a different kind of air war was raging thousands of kilometers away. On the Eastern Front, German and Soviet aircraft spent most of their time between 5,000 and 15,000 feet. Stuka dive bombers came screaming down at treetop height. Ju-88s and He-111s did their level bombing runs far below 20,000 feet. Fighters from both sides stayed in that same band, covering ground forces, diving on tanks, and dueling above battles like Kursk. This was not a war of B-17s at 25,000 feet, dueling with Bf-109s in thin air. It was a brutal, low to medium altitude knife fight over trenches, artillery batteries, and burning villages. In late 1941, the first P-39s and P-400s began arriving in the Soviet Union via Arctic convoys to Murmansk. Soviet pilots knew exactly what they were getting: rejected Western hardware. Word had already filtered through that the British didn't want the Airacobra and that American pilots in the Pacific hated it. The first test flights seemed to confirm the worst rumors. Soviet test pilots deliberately tried to trigger the spin behavior they'd heard about, and, unlike American test crews, they had no trouble getting the aircraft to flip into a dangerous flat spin when the nose cannon ammo bay was empty. The results were so dramatic that the American observers present were genuinely shaken. They hadn't been able to reproduce that spin back home. But the Soviets didn't stop there. They did something Western evaluators hadn't done. They paid close attention to how the aircraft behaved at the altitudes where they actually expected to fight. Below 15,000 feet, the P-39 suddenly looked like a completely different airplane. At 10,000–12,000 feet, the Allison engine pulled hard. The aircraft accelerated well, rolled quickly, and turned sharply enough to hang with most German types of the time. The visibility from the cockpit was excellent, thanks to the car-style side doors and clear canopy. The tricycle landing gear made takeoffs and landings easier on rough Soviet airstrips than many tail-dragging Soviet designs. And then there was the radio. Soviet fighter pilots in 1941 and early 1942 flew into combat essentially half-deaf. Many Yak and MiG fighters carried no radio at all. Those that did often had unreliable sets with short range and constant interference. A flight leader trying to direct his unit might as well have been shouting into the wind. Coordination was primitive. Surprise German attacks were common. Soviet formations often flew as scattered clusters of individuals rather than as disciplined teams. The P-39 changed that overnight. The American SCR-522 radio in the Airacobra was powerful, clear, and, most importantly, reliable. Pilots who had spent years essentially isolated in the cockpit suddenly found themselves talking to each other in real time as if they were sitting side by side. They could warn each other about incoming fighters, call out bomber positions, coordinate who would dive and who would stay high, and react instantly to changing threats. Ground controllers could vector formations onto German aircraft using radar information instead of hoping fighters just happened to be in the right area. For Soviet pilots, that felt like stepping into the future. The armament also hit a sweet spot for the kind of fighting they were doing. The heavy 37mm cannon, properly cared for by mechanics and used at short range, was devastating. One hit could blow the tail off a Bf-109 or shred a Stuka. The two nose-mounted 50 cals provided a dense stream of fire to bracket a target before finishing it with the cannon. Soviet units quickly realized that the 30 caliber wing guns added weight and complexity for little gain. They pulled them off, saving around 60 pounds plus ammunition and moving the center of gravity slightly forward. That made the aircraft more stable and increased its roll rate. It also removed one of the factors contributing to the spin issues. None of this required permission from an engineering board in some distant headquarters. Soviet mechanics had the freedom, and often the encouragement, to modify aircraft based on real combat experience. If a pilot came back and said, "This thing rolls too slowly," you didn't file a memo and wait 3 months. You took guns off the wings, adjusted control cables, and tried again. Piece by piece, Soviet units tuned the Airacobra into exactly the machine they wanted. Getting those machines to the front, though, was an ordeal all its own. P-39s destined for the Soviet Union started life at Bell Aircraft's plant near Niagara Falls, New York. From there, ferry pilots, including women from the U.S. Women Air Force Service Pilots Program, flew them across the continent to places like Great Falls, Montana. From Montana, male ferry pilots took them farther northwest to Fairbanks or Nome, Alaska. That leg alone meant hundreds of miles of wilderness with few navigational aids and nowhere good to put down if something went wrong. The real danger started when Soviet pilots took over. The Alaska-Siberia route, known as ALSIB, required flying single-engine fighters over the frigid Bering Sea and then across the vast emptiness of northeastern Siberia. A mechanical failure over open water meant a quick death in freezing seas. A navigation error could leave a pilot lost over endless forest or tundra with no chance of rescue. The only safety net was the presence of twin-engine escort aircraft carrying navigators and radios. Fighters flew in trail, following those escorts like ducklings. Storms were constant. Visibility could vanish in minutes, and airfields on both sides were primitive. Many aircraft simply disappeared along that route. Those that survived the trip were inspected and serviced at Soviet collection points in Siberia, then handed off again to ferry pilots who flew them westward, airfield by airfield, until they reached combat regiments near the front. By the time a P-39 arrived in a frontline unit like the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, it had already survived a journey halfway around the world. That's where Pokryshkin met it. Alexander Pokryshkin wasn't a typical line pilot. By the time his regiment began converting to P-39s in early 1943, he already had nearly 20 confirmed kills in Soviet-built MiGs and Yaks. He also had a reputation for breaking rules, ignoring outdated doctrine, and thinking hard about tactics. Many Soviet fighter units early in the war still flew according to rigid pre-war manuals that bore little resemblance to the reality of facing experienced German pilots. Pokryshkin ignored those manuals. He sketched his own diagrams, wrote his own notes, and spent long evenings analyzing why certain engagements had gone well or badly. When the Airacobras arrived, he didn't treat them as a consolation prize. He treated them as a new tool. He spent weeks flying the type behind the lines, testing climb rates at different altitudes, roll behavior at different speeds, and how the cannon and machine guns behaved at various ranges. He talked constantly with his mechanics about maintenance issues and asked them to tweak controls and systems based on his feedback. One of his biggest innovations was a formation concept that later became known as the bookcase or bookshelf system. Instead of flying all his fighters at one altitude in a single loose line, he arranged them on several levels, stacked vertically like shelves. The lowest shelf flew at an altitude where it could pounce on enemy aircraft attacking Soviet ground forces. The middle shelf stayed higher, watching for German fighters trying to dive on the low group. The top shelf remained above everyone, ready to crash down on any enemy that committed to an attack. With reliable radios, these shelves could talk constantly, warn each other, and hand off targets. If a German formation tried to escape by diving away, somebody on a lower shelf was waiting. If they tried to climb out, somebody above could cut them off. This approach required discipline and communication, exactly the strengths that the P-39's radio brought to the table. Pokryshkin also embraced ground-controlled intercepts. As mobile radar sets arrived at Soviet front headquarters, he worked with controllers to develop standard procedures. Fighters would be scrambled, vectored onto German bombers by radio, and arrive in position with altitude and the sun in their favor, just as the Luftwaffe had been doing in 1941. Now the tables were starting to turn. On April 9, 1943, Pokryshkin took his P-39 into combat for the first time over the Kuban bridgehead. 8 Airacobras from his regiment were vectored toward German fighters attacking Soviet Ley GD-3s. Pokryshkin attacked from above, rolling into a firing pass on a Bf-109 that was too focused on the fight below to see the danger coming. He closed to short range before pulling the trigger. The nose, 50 cals walked, strikes up the Messerschmitt's fuselage. Then the 37mm cannon joined in. Heavy shells smashed into the engine. The German fighter blew apart and went down in flames. The useless American fighter had just scored its first victory in Soviet hands. 3 days later, on April 12th, he led another mission over the same sector. This time, using his layered formation concept and constant radio calls, he and his unit caught a larger group of Bf-109s. In the swirling engagement that followed, Pokryshkin personally shot down 4 enemy fighters. His regiment suffered no losses. Between April 9th and the end of that month, he claimed 12 victories in P-39s. Other pilots in his unit were learning fast and adding their own kills. By late April, German pilots in the area were sending back uneasy reports. Soviet fighters with unfamiliar silhouettes, heavy nose armament, and unusually good coordination were appearing over the front. These weren't the clumsy, poorly organized opponents of 1941. The Soviet High Command took notice. On May 24, 1943, Pokryshkin received the title Hero of the Soviet Union for the first time. He would receive it twice more before the war was over. Pokryshkin was only the beginning. The Airacobra seemed to unlock something in several Soviet pilots. Grigori Rechkalov, one of Pokryshkin's closest comrades, had started the war flying older I-16s and biplanes and had even been badly wounded in 1941. He hid a color blindness problem from medical boards and clawed his way back into a cockpit. When his regiment converted to P-39s, everything clicked. Over the next 2 years, he would score the majority of his 56 victories in Airacobras. Often in aircraft, he treated almost like personal possessions. 2 of them carried his initials on the tail, and ground crews maintained them with obsessive care. Nikolai Golubev, another top ace, preferred to practically put his nose into the enemy before firing. The P-39's concentrated forward armament suited that perfectly. He would close until he could clearly see details on the enemy aircraft, then unleash cannon and 50 cal fire in one brutal burst. It was risky, but devastating. Dmitri Glinka took almost the opposite approach, more analytical and methodical than aggressive. He kept notes on German tactics, studied how different enemy units behaved, and shared his observations with younger pilots. He, too, did his best work in P-39s. Alexander Klubov, Ivan Babak, and others followed the same pattern. Pilots who had been competent, but not extraordinary, in Soviet types, suddenly saw their effectiveness jump when they moved into Airacobras with good radios, strong firepower, and reliable engines. By the middle of the war, roughly half of the Soviet Union's top 10 aces had scored the majority of their kills in P-39s. One of them, Pokryshkin, would become the highest-scoring Allied ace to fly an American-designed fighter of any kind. Meanwhile, in the West, the P-39 was remembered mainly as a disappointment. Lend-Lease eventually sent 4,700-plus Airacobras to the Soviet Union, almost half of all P-39s built. More than a third of all Allied fighters supplied to the USSR were P-39s. They weren't a side note. They were a major pillar of Soviet air power. They were also used hard. Between 1942 and 1945, Soviet units lost just over 1,000 P-39s. Losses climbed in 1943 and 1944 as the Red Army pushed west into areas where German defenses were denser and newer fighters like late-model Bf-109s and Fw-190s were more common. But the critical figure is not how many were lost. It's what they achieved while they were being lost. By mid-1943, after P-39 units had time to establish themselves, their kill ratios against the Luftwaffe turned positive. In many engagements, Airacobra formations were destroying 2, 3, or more German aircraft for each Airacobra lost. Across the Eastern Front as a whole, the Luftwaffe's early war dominance was eroding. In 1941, German fighters often enjoyed kill ratios of 5-to-1 or better. By late 1943, that overall figure had dropped toward parity, and in sectors where P-39 units like the 16th Guards were operating, it tilted in the Soviets' favor. German radio intercept units eventually learned Pokryshkin's call sign, Sotka, meaning 100, after the white number painted on his aircraft. On days when radio traffic confirmed that Sotka was airborne, some German units were explicitly told to avoid combat unless absolutely necessary. Think about that for a moment. An American-built fighter that the U.S. and Britain had essentially thrown away was now so effective in Soviet hands that German pilots on the Eastern Front were being told not to tangle with it if they could help it. That wasn't magic. It was the result of tactics, context, and a willingness to adapt. So what actually changed? The airframe didn't. The engines, the guns, the basic design, all of that was the same metal Bell shipped from New York. 3 big factors made the difference. 1. Altitude and mission profile. The P-39 had been crippled at high altitude when its turbocharger was removed. Western air forces then tried to use it for high-altitude roles anyway, escorting bombers, intercepting raids at 20,000, 30,000 feet. In that band, the Airacobra was a dog, and the pilots paid the price. On the Eastern Front, almost nobody fought at those heights. Bombing runs, ground attack, fighter cover, all of it happened where the P-39's Allison engine still had plenty of air. In that environment, it could keep up, turn, and climb well enough to be competitive. 2. Tactics and doctrine. U.S. fighter doctrine in the Pacific leaned heavily on individual initiative. Pilots were expected to chase opportunities, break formation when they saw a good shot, and rely on their aircraft's power and climb to save them from bad situations. That worked in something like a P-38, with 2 engines and great high-altitude performance. In a P-39 pushed to its limits, it could be fatal. Soviet doctrine by 1943 was trending in the other direction. After suffering horribly in 1941 with rigid, outdated formations, the VVS had shifted toward flexible but disciplined pair and flight tactics. Pilots could maneuver and make decisions, but they were expected to keep their wingman in sight and stay within the framework of the larger formation. The P-39's strengths, communications, firepower, solid low-altitude performance, fit that approach almost perfectly. Used as a team with stacked shelves of fighters, good radio calls, and clear roles, Airacobras became murderously effective. Used as solo machines chasing bombers at high altitude, they were out of their depth. 3. Attitude toward modifications. American ground crews followed technical orders. If the manual said a certain gun installation was part of the design, you kept it. Field-expedient modifications were discouraged or outright banned unless they came with official engineering approval from above. Soviet mechanics had far more leeway. If wing guns caused problems or didn't pull their weight, they came off. If control cables felt too loose, they were tightened beyond factory specs. If radios needed to be rewired or moved, they were. The question wasn't, "Is this how Bell designed it?" It was, "Does this help us kill Germans and bring our pilots home alive?" The result was that Soviet P-39s and American P-39s slowly diverged in feel and function even though they shared the same basic structure. Combine the right altitude band, the right tactics, and a willingness to treat the airplane as a starting point instead of a finished product, and the worst fighter suddenly looked very different. By 1944, newer Soviet designs like the LA-7 and Yak-3 were arriving at the front, but the Airacobra stayed in service. Pilots who knew it well didn't want to give it up, and for many roles it was still entirely adequate. On May 9, 1945, the very last day of fighting in Europe, a Soviet P-39 scored one final distinction. Over Prague, Captain Vasily Shishov, flying an Airacobra, intercepted a German FW-189 reconnaissance aircraft. In the chaos of the collapsing front, the Luftwaffe was still trying to gather information. Shishov closed in, lined up his guns, and shot the German machine down. It was the final confirmed Allied air-to-air victory in the European theater. Hours later, Germany surrendered. The same day, in another corner of the crumbling Reich, a German Me-262 jet shot down a P-39, one of the last kills scored by the Luftwaffe. The failed American fighter that Western air forces had largely abandoned had been there at the start of Soviet Lend-Lease operations and was there at the very end, trading blows with the most advanced jets Nazi Germany ever fielded. Soviet units kept their Airacobras in front-line service until 1949, long after U.S. forces had gotten rid of theirs. After the war, American analysts went digging through Soviet records and interviews, trying to understand how the numbers could be so different. How had one Air Force produced only a single P-39 Ace, while another produced dozens? Some suggested that Soviet claims were exaggerated. Others argued that German opposition must have been weaker in the East. But German records didn't support that. Many of the same fighter units that had dominated the skies in 1941-42 were still on the Eastern Front in 1943-44. Now suffering heavier losses, the answer was uncomfortable but simple. The P-39 had not been a universally bad fighter. It had been a fighter mismatched to Western mission requirements and much better suited to the brutal mid-altitude war in the East. When you gave it a battlefield where almost everything happened below 15,000 feet, pilots trained to fight as coordinated teams, mechanics free to tweak and lighten the airframe, and a doctrine that valued communication as much as pure performance. It became something very different from the disappointment that U.S. and British pilots remembered. Pokryshkin ended the war with 59 confirmed victories, 47 of them in P-39s. He was decorated 3 times as a hero of the Soviet Union, eventually rose to the rank of Marshal of Aviation, and never changed his view that the Airacobra, used properly, was an excellent fighter. Rechkalov finished with 56-plus shared kills, most in P-39s, and went on to a long post-war career in Soviet air defense. Other Soviet aces who flew Airacobras remembered them with real affection. They mentioned the cannon, the sturdy construction, but more than anything, they talked about the radio. For men who had begun the war shouting hand signals in unresponsive Soviet fighters, suddenly being able to talk freely to their comrades in the middle of a dogfight felt like cheating. It was that powerful. Western histories still tend to give the P-39 a few paragraphs at most, usually focusing on its poor high-altitude performance and obscure spin issues. In museums, it's often presented as a cautionary tale of a bad design. The numbers tell a different story. Soviet pilots flying P-39s claimed somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 victories once you adjust for overclaiming that every Air Force was guilty of. They turned a supposed failure into one of the most effective Allied fighters on a major front. The aircraft didn't change. The context did. The P-39 story is about more than one misunderstood fighter. It's a warning about how easy it is to label something useless when you've only seen it used in the wrong way. The Americans and British didn't misjudge the Airacobra out of malice or stupidity. They judged it against the specific jobs they needed done: high-altitude escort, long-range interception, island hopping with big stretches of ocean between airfields. For those jobs, the P-39 really was a bad choice. The Soviet Union, fighting a different kind of war under different constraints, needed something else: a tough, low to medium altitude brawler with heavy forward firepower and a radio that actually worked. For that job, the P-39 turned out to be almost ideal. Same machine. Completely opposite verdict. In the end, that's why this forgotten fighter matters. It's not just another oddball aircraft with a quirky layout and a big gun. It's a reminder The tools, ideas, and designs can't be judged in a vacuum. They have to be matched to the world they're actually used in. The Airacobra failed when it was forced into roles it was never meant to perform. It became a legend when it finally found the war it had quietly been built for, low over the fields and forests of the Eastern Front, in the hands of pilots who understood exactly what it could and couldn't do. If you want more stories like this, where the worst weapon on paper becomes a war winner in the right hands, let us know. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, and share this with someone who still thinks the P-39 was a joke. Because somewhere over the Kuban in 1943, a Soviet pilot in an American reject fighter would strongly disagree.